to close on one. This is number 10. And this one is, again, from Bart Ehrman. He teams up with Paulogia in this video to talk about kind of the problem with apologists. He uses that word in a very derogatory term, which isn't at all uncommon in the online space, but kind of looking at the date, particularly of the gospel stories and what that has to do with the credibility of whether we can take them seriously. So let's watch that.
First time it's mentioned is 40 years after the fact by an author who not only was not there, he is living in a different part of the world. He's speaking a different language. He doesn't know any eyewitnesses. He doesn't say anything about any eyewitnesses. He doesn't name any eyewitnesses. He's simply giving you a story that he's heard about something that happened 40 years earlier. That is the basis for a fact. Is this how historians do their work? I mean, obviously, look, none of these apologists is a historian. I don't think any of them has read any historiography. I don't think that they know. Maybe William Lane Craig has. I don't know. I mean, but he certainly doesn't work like any other historian works. You cannot use the kind of criteria that he uses for the historical Jesus to do ancient history or to do medieval history or any other kind of history.
Now, one of the problems with TikToks in general is often you get these snippets, which are a small part of a larger conversation. And the larger video here is sort of a criticism of the various facts historically that are often used to try and reconstruct the resurrection of Jesus, one of which being the burial of Jesus in a well-known tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, as the gospel accounts testify. And he picks up here on, a number of claims that are pretty wild when you actually get to know people who would be counted as apologists, I guess. People like William Lane Craig, who has a PhD in this very field from a university in Germany, or like people like John Dixon, who hates the term apologetics at the same time, but engages in it at a historical level of trying to assess what is the historical value from our sources of many of the claims around the death and resurrection of Jesus. What can we infer reasonably from that? Where are the limits? But the particular one they've got in focus here is the claim around Jesus' burial in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. And his central claim is, look, the first account we have of this comes 40 years after the effect, which is basically dating the Gospel of Mark to what is a pretty standard timeline in New Testament studies of a 70 AD date, which then would put Matthew and Luke somewhere in the 80s AD and the Gospel of John 90 or 100 AD. It's a pretty standard timeline. So there's a lot, obviously, in this. Let's just go over the slight that Christian apologists have no knowledge of how to do history reading or historiography. He wasn't having a go at you, Wes. It's okay. But let's kind of explore more those gospel dates, because I do think this is a relevant question. And maybe the viewers might be asking, what do you mean, Dan? Well, when it comes to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, these are our primary sources into the life of Jesus. And the concern is if it begins at AD 70, the first one being written, and then 80s and then 90s AD, well, you're looking 40, 50, 60 years after the events before any of the knowledge of them is actually penned or written down into some kind of biographical record. Doesn't that mean that you're beyond living memory? Probably the people that penned this weren't there. You've also got the inference that, they're writing in a language that Jesus didn't speak. They're writing in Greek. Jesus would have spoken Aramaic, most likely, as the kind of Galilee and Judea region where he grew up. And as a result, it seems like these are generations after Jesus of later Christians that are kind of writing the story. What touch have they got? And certainly calling into question traditional authorship. Mark didn't write Mark because, well, he's a Judean Jew. He's not equipped to be able to write in this high-level Greek. Neither was Matthew. Luke might be the only one potentially that could, because he was a Gentile physician. But John, we can't trust traditional authorship because it's language and quality of language. It's way beyond them. There's a lot in there, but I just thought it'd be worthwhile talking about the Gospels themselves, about their dating, about their authorship, in order to talk about the credibility that they carry as witnesses to the historical Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, I personally would take a much earlier date than Ehrman would on almost all of the books. I think that I date the synoptics pretty early, and I think there's good reason to date them, not just pre-70, but early within that time frame. I actually agree with the standard dating of John for various reasons, but when you were talking, I just reached over on my shelf, and if anybody's interested, this book, Rethinking the Dates of the New Testament, the Evidence for Early Composition by Jonathan Bernier, who's a professor over in my neck of the woods at the University of Toronto. I think this is a good kind of volume. I don't agree with everything he says. I actually think some books are dated later than he thinks they're dated, but I think this is a good synopsis. And he goes through the evidence and admits, what the counterpoints would be and concedes certain points and says, that there's good evidence on the other side as well. So I think if the listener, if the viewer is really interested in what are the arguments for, say, an early date, and he even gives the arguments for late dates, I think that is a good place. I think so. In addressing what Ehrman said specifically, I think it's true that Joseph of Arimathea is mentioned by name, right, in Mark and Luke's gospel. And as you mentioned there, Dan, he's referring to Mark's gospel specifically. And those two individuals were not disciples of Jesus, like Matthew and John. Nonetheless, I would say that all the evidence points to Mark being an accurate retelling of Peter's account. And Peter was a disciple, right? So likewise, Luke goes to lengths to make sure his audience knows that he's writing history, and he's doing things like interviewing eyewitnesses. He says that right off the bat in his preface. So he's not under any illusion or pretense that he himself was there. He says as much, but he's getting his stories from those who were there. So I think Ehrman is incorrect here. I think he's over-exaggerating the case quite a bit. These are stories, when we're talking about the Gospels, that are being relayed from eyewitnesses. Now, Ehrman says they're not, and I think the actual testimony of what Luke says indicates otherwise, and the unanimous, unequivocal early church testimony for whom Mark is likewise echoes that. But I also think, just like you said, Dan, it's a little bit disappointing to hear Ehrman castigate apologists in that way. Now, it seems from that clip that, right, he is addressing particular apologists in question in regard to what he's answering. But I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt and say that maybe he's been given a quote, right? He's responding to a particular apologist, and he's not talking about the formal Christian apologetics community more broadly, because if so, that's untrue, because Bart has actually interacted with many genuine historians who do Christian apologetics, right? Dan Wallace, Justin Bass, Peter J. Williams, Craig Evans, Mike Lacona, Craig Blomberg, Darrell Bach, Mike Bird. Like, I'm running out of breath naming all the people that I can think of off the top of my head that Ehrman has actually debated, in the same room. All of these people are trained professional historians who are actively in their field of historiography. They teach, they publish. And all of these individuals who I just named have done formal dialogue with Ehrman, and that there's a host of other people who likewise do some form of Christian apologetics who are also competent historians in their own right, right? You mentioned John Dixon, Grant Petrie, Peter Gurry, John Mead, Chuck Hill, Lydia McGrew, Craig Keener, Beth Shepard, Rob Bowman. Once again, I can think of historians who are active in the field of historiography who are also engaged in some level of Christian apologetics. And we could go on and on. So I think it's, at minimum, I think Bart is taking a particular argument, which may very well be the majority position in secular scholarship on the dating of the Gospels, but then he's reading this hyper-skeptical view of their authorship and their reliability in terms of early eyewitness testimony. I would say actually that the evidence points in the other direction. These things are chock full of early eyewitness testimony. Read Lydia McGrew's work on this. Read Peter J. Williams' work on this. Read Rob Bowman's work on this. Like, there's just so much scholarship that's being done pointing to the reliability, the trustworthiness of the actual content of the Gospels coming from the time frame of Jesus, from individuals who were there, or at minimum, like Luke says, interviewing eyewitnesses who were there. So the author isn't necessarily there, but they're making sure that they're going to the source information. So I think, unfortunately, what Bart is doing is he's holding a particular lens, right? We talked about it before. People don't come to conclusions based on some sort of objective, neutral standpoint. Everybody has their preconceived ideas. I do, and so does Bart. And I think Bart is coming to them with a skeptical point of view, assuming certain things upon the text, which I think are actually not giving the text the benefit of the doubt that they deserve. And then he's broad brushing and saying, well, anybody who defends these things obviously can't be doing good history, when I can name dozens of good historians who are in fact doing that.
And I think it's fair just to point out as well that Bart's right in critiquing bad apologetics where you do see it. And Christians can make bad arguments, and I see that all the time play out on social media too. I'm sure some of my educated friends would look at some things that they hear Christians say, just, oh, really? That's such a bad claim. And sadly, like with bad arguments against belief in God and Christianity, they seem to spread way more. It's, I guess, maybe one of the faults of online forums. But in critiquing bad stuff, you do want to make sure that you do give credit to good arguments as well. And maybe this is one of just those points of saying sometimes where you've got a consensus opinion. Consensus opinions can be ideologically driven and they can be methodologically driven in that there can be shortcomings in a particular field. And so one of the things I want to do as you get more familiar with these ideas and arguments is actually credit the quality of arguments and don't just line up a list of people that agree with you. Actually wrestle with the material to see whether or not it stands up under scrutiny. Because even as an outsider, you can come and say, why do they believe that? What are the reasons that draw them towards these conclusions? Are those conclusions warranted based on the degree of evidence that they're giving to support it? And I just think asking some critical questions like that can be really helpful in actually challenging some of these positions. And we do have a long form videos on most of those sort of key questions on the dating of the Gospels, on the authorship of the Gospels. We've got a 2-hour live stream that you and I did with Inspiring Philosophy, Michael Jones as well, on Are the Gospels History. If you want to go and check them out, that'd be really worthwhile. We do have a question from a viewer, Callum, who said, what book by John Dixon would you recommend? You mentioned he does apologetics whilst disliking the label. Yep, John's a friend, someone I have a lot of admiration for. He's a fellow Aussie, and so we operate in similar circles. He's really well known for a great book called Bullies and Saints. I don't know if you've got that one. Is that what you're pulling off? Which is more looking at the good and bad of church history and just trying to get an honest label of what is the kind of value that the church has bequeathed to civilization as a result of Christ and the gospel. And then also what's the mess where they haven't followed Jesus the way that they should and brought the Christian story into disrepute. But he's got earlier works. There's a small volume called Is Jesus History that's worth checking out as part of, yeah, there you go. It's a good one. And then some much earlier work he did called The Christ Files, which you can pick up as well that explore kind of the value of the historical Jesus. He's got a series called The Doubter's Guide. So The Doubter's Guide to the Bible, The Doubter's Guide to the Ten Commandments, The Doubter's Guide to Jesus. They're actually really worthwhile picking up and reading through as well. He's fun and fair and very, very balanced. And if you're keen on just listening rather than actually reading, his podcast Undeceptions is brilliant. There's seasons now of episodes where they ask big questions and they bring on different guests from around the world to be able to help speak to it. So you can check that out wherever you get your podcasts from, which is great. Well, mate, we've been through 10 fire